The subject of the UK's railways is one that's very close to my heart. Not only did I work in the sector for a couple of years myself, but my dad was a full-blown train spotter in his youth and always had a deep interest in locomotives and the railways. The railways in the UK are often treated as a political battleground, with those on the left calling for them to be nationalised. There are some problems with our railways, but I do not think that nationalisation is the answer. Before I get on to exactly why, let us take a step back and recap the history of the railways and how we reached the system we now have. The UK has the oldest railway system in the world. It was initially developed by private companies competing against each other. Steam locomotion started near the beginning of the 19th century, but it was in the 1840s where the size of the rail network massively grew. In a short period of time, the railways went from a few isolated lines to a national network around 10,000 miles in length, which is roughly what it is today, although some of the routes have changed since then. During this time, the government operated a laissez-faire approach to overseeing the railways. Anyone could set up a company, and very little formal approval was needed to go start laying tracks. The creation of the rail network transformed British society. People could now easily visit parts of the country, trading was much easier, there were some profound social effects. The system was quite dangerous, occasionally locomotives would explode, trains would derail, but overall, there were massive benefits to the country. During the First World War, the railways were taken into government control. They were returned to the private sector in 1921. However, the government forced the 100-plus companies that were operating to merge into just four: the Southern Railway, the London Midland Scottish Railway, the London North Eastern Railway, and the Great Western Railway. The industry then stayed under private ownership for 26 years until the government nationalised the railways, forming British Rail. British Rail existed until the mid-1990s. This is where things start to get a bit complicated. The infrastructure, so tracks, signals, tunnels, that sort of stuff, went to Railtrack. Ownership of trains went to 3 rolling stock operating companies, or ROSCOs as they say, which were then leased out to different operators that run the train services, or TOCs. These operators bid through a franchising process to operate the various lines. In 2001, the government nationalised Railtrack, rebranding it as Network Rail, and, in the main, this is largely how things have stayed. So when politicians call for nationalisation, they're talking about the ROSCOs and the train operators. The core infrastructure is already publicly owned. So how have things worked out over time? Well, at a high level, passenger numbers fell during the First World War, went up and down when reprivatised, and then fell quite a lot under British Rail. And when the government re-privatised, passenger numbers massively increased. Government intervention is not the sole reason why we've seen these movements. The role of the car, for example, also had a big effect. So we'll need to look a bit closer at what's been going on to understand the differences between state or privately owned operations. This chart shows the level of investment before and after privatisation. Investment in rolling stock slightly fell, but there was a massive increase in investment in the network, and delays fell by about 16%, so some pretty good news stories. However, what ultimately brought down Railtrack was the media's portrayal of its safety record. The Hatfield crash led to a massive media backlash and Railtrack being converted into Network Rail. This is despite the Health and Safety Commission concluding that safety performance was the same before and after privatisation, and trains passing signals, which is a measure of risk, had consistently fallen. To be clear, Railtrack did not shower itself in glory, and through the ensuing court case it emerged there had been some pretty poor handling of its maintenance contracts. Although, it should be noted that there had been a sustained level of underinvestment from the previous British Rail, leading to a load of the tracks falling apart. Once Railtrack took over, it had increased the level of infrastructure renewals by about a third, but that on its own hadn't been enough. So the idea was to have Network Rail manage the infrastructure, essentially the same company as Railtrack, but now with no shareholders. After Network Rail was set up in 2002, it started spending money like water. There was a term used in the sector known as the efficiency reset. Basically, due to Network Rail trying to address all potential safety risks with minimal information available to it about which assets could fail, it massively lost sight of doing things efficiently. It has since been successful in improving safety. The UK railways are now among the safest in the world. In some measures, we have the safest railways in Europe. However, it is not efficient. In 2011, the government published an independent review of the value for money of the UK's railways. It found that the privately owned train operating companies' costs were comparable to, if not below, those of the state-run operators in Europe, whereas the state-owned Network Rail was around 30% more expensive than comparators. 30% is a lot. Network Rail has revenues of around £6 billion a year, so 30% being wasted is nearly £2 billion a year down the drain. Or, if you want to think about that another way, if we didn't waste this amount of money, we could increase the number of nurses in the country by over 50%. Network Rail has also had issues delivering new projects and has caused numerous delays. When it causes delays, it often gets fined by the regulator, the Office of Rail and Road. Now, if Network Rail was a private company, such fines would come out of the shareholders' pockets. However, as it is owned by the state, it either has to cut spending to pay the fine, or takes out more debt. Network Rail is currently carrying £42 billion worth of debt, which is underwritten by the taxpayer. So it is very clear to me that the biggest problem the rail sector has is with the state-owned bit, not with the privately owned trains. Now, there are some issues with the trains. The one we're probably most aware of is that when the workers go on strike for feeble reasons. The solution to that is most definitely not nationalisation, as bringing all staff under a single employer makes industrial action easier to coordinate. The second big issue with the trains is the whole franchising system. Due to franchises being set for a finite number of years, train companies have limited reason to invest in the rolling stock as they get towards the end of their franchise. Why invest if your franchise is about to come to an end? Initially, franchises were run for around 7 years. Generally, they are now run for longer, but the maximum length is capped under EU law. We can see in this graph how since 2006, the average age of the rolling stock has gone up by around a year each year. In other words, trains are not being replaced, they're just getting older and older. The process through which franchises are awarded is also problematic. It takes ages and is very expensive. The Department for Transport has also been known to mess up how it assesses bids from prospective train operators wanting to operate a given line. A few years ago, the Intercity West Coast franchise was completely messed up by the government at huge public expense. But remember, even with these failings, the train operating company's costs are comparable to, if not below, those of state-run operators in Europe. So let's take a look at ownership models from elsewhere. A study from Switzerland showed that their private railways are much more efficient than their state-owned ones, and numerous studies showed that further autonomy from the state has improved efficiency right across Europe. A study of 19 different OECD countries found that railway systems with high dependence on public subsidies are significantly less efficient than similar railways with less dependence, and railways with a high degree of managerial autonomy tend to achieve higher efficiency. There has also been some success from privatisation in South America. The railways I've personally been most impressed by are Japan's. Japan has a handful of privately owned regional regulated companies. These companies do both the infrastructure and the trains. Privatisation does not necessarily mean an end to taxpayer subsidy. Many countries have private railways, but with some taxpayer subsidy to keep ticket prices down for social or political reasons. I think something like the Japanese model would be a much better model for the UK. It would enable a private sector mentality to managing costs and performance. It would get rid of the problems associated with the franchising process, and would break Network Rail up into some smaller, more manageable parts. Started for 10, why not the big four companies we had in the 20s, 30s and the Second World War? It was private companies and individual ingenuity that built the railways. I think they'd be much better at running them than what we have at the moment.